Happy Saturday. How are you all doing? Hey Melanie, happy Saturday. Hi, Kaia, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm good.
Trying to make this look normal-ish.
Take the short
Hand on my.
thing. Hey, Cole. I'm so happy to chat with you about your book.
I'm happy to be here. Literally.
So let me know when you're ready and we'll jump right in.
Okay. Let's see if I can get this stand to work.
Oh,
Okay, this is good.
good, you're good?
I think so.
Good. Welcome. Um,
Thank you.
yes, it's our book chat day. For you all that don't know, I'm Jamise. I'm the founder of Diverse Spines, and our October Spine of the Month was Sisters in Arms by Kai Alderson. And I'm so happy to have her join us today to talk about her debut historical fiction novel. Yes, gorgeous cover, by the way. And
Thank you.
you know what? I was really honored to. I did a cover reveal for your cover.
You did the cover reveal, yes.
The cover reveal, yes, over on Spines and Vines. So thank you for giving me that opportunity. It was so awesome.
I was excited.
So, how are you doing? How has everything been going for you with the release of the book? It came out in August, correct?
Yes, it came out in August. I don't remember September or August. It was cool.
Okay,
It's
great.
cool. Yeah.
Good. You're just a little bit fuzzy. I don't know. Maybe the camera, you might want to wipe it off just a little bit. You're just a little bit fuzzy.
I have a thingy.
You can use your shirt. There you go. That's it.
Okay, cool.
That's it. So I'm going to give a little bit of background and we're just going to dive right in. Your name is Kaia Alderson. You're a historical women's fiction author with a passion for discovering hidden figures in African American women's history. Sisters in Arms is your debut historical fiction novel. I love historical fiction. You have also published romantic comedy and historical romance works under the name of Kaia Danielle, as well as a few comic short stories. You've been featured on Book Riot and Bustle websites, and you are an alumna of Spelman College and the University of West Georgia.
Yes.
So I'm so happy to have you here. For you all in the audience, if you have any questions, please put them in the question box and I will ask them towards the end of our conversation. But to kick off, I want you to tell us a little bit about Sisters in Arms.
Sisters in Arms. Sisters in Arms is a novel, so it's fiction based on the true story of the Black women who served in the United States military during World War II. It follows two fictional characters. Basically, at that point in life, when things aren't going, that life plan you set for yourself just kind of explodes in your face, and so they decide to join the army instead in 1942.
Awesome. And so, can you tell me a little bit about your origin story? Like, did you always know you wanted to be a writer? And then let's talk a little bit about your publishing journey since this was your debut novel.
Yes. Did I always I kind of always wanted to write. It took me a while to accept that I myself was a writer or had the audacity to think anybody wanted to read what I had to say. So in college is when no, in high school when we did one of those assignments in school and you're like, okay, write something creative. And then it wound up in the literary journal. I was like, oh, I guess I'm good at this. And
Right.
then kind of went from there, building the confidence bit by bit. My publishing origin story is I published my first short story in 2002.
Mm-hmm.
I have written for, if you remember, Bronze Thrills, Black Romance, Confessions magazines. That's where I cut my teeth. And then from there, life happened, and it took a while. And then in 2015 is when my rom-com novella came out, Calling Her Bluff. And then 2018 is when I self-published a historical romance novella called A Secret Desire. And Sisters in Arms was supposed to be another historical romance novella that no one would ever read because who wants to read about Black women in World War II? And then I met up with my now editor, and she's like, "No, I want this book, and I want women's fiction." And I was like, "Okay." And so I figured out how to write 100,000 words instead of 25,000 words, and here we are.
Wow, what a journey! And so I
Mm-hmm.
have to ask this because I've never heard of this story, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure a lot of people have not. And so,
Mm-hmm.
number one, how did you come to the story? Like, what inspired you to write the story?
It started with this picture. I don't know if it comes out okay.
Yes, it does.
I've always, okay. I've always been a bit of a World War II history geek
Mm-hmm.
and women's history geek. So I knew women had served in World War II, and obviously I knew Black people served in World War II. But when I saw this picture float on my timeline on Twitter, I was like, it was the first time I saw Black women in uniform. And I was just like, okay, they're in Black uniforms that looks like Europe, that looks like World War II. What is that?
Mm-hmm.
And so
So
I
it's
Googled
floating
it.
on Twitter.
Yeah, it was just on Twitter. And it was just, a picture speaks 1,000 words. And you're just like,
Yes.
so basically, I just Googled Black women World War II and their story popped up. That's the actual 6888. That was them in France. They were marching in a parade in the square where Joan of Arc was burned at the stake and commemorating her death. I think it was like 500 years or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So it was like, okay, we were over there. Never see that in the movies. So come to find out, they were the only unit, all Black, all female unit that was sent overseas during World War II to Europe. So they were in England and they were in France.
So you said they were the only ones.
They were the only ones sent over there during the war. Towards the end of the war, and just after, you had a little bit more integrated units. It was like, little small groups, but in terms of just one whole battalion, that was just all Black, all female. That was the only one. So immediately, once I heard about this story, I was like, I'm going to do Soldier Girls Last Night in Town before she ships out.
Oh, yeah, like the guy. Yes.
Yes. So that sequence did make it into this final book. There's a whole sequence of her last night in New York before she ships out.
Yes.
And it was supposed to be just a romantic story centered around that. And once I had more room to play, I was like, okay, there's more things I can talk about in this story. So a lot of there's a lot of real people in there. A lot of side characters are actual real people. Charity Adams, if you read the book,
Got one that I really
she's
want to have
real.
a connection with.
Oh yeah, I won't go into that now. But yeah, she's real. And then when they're in training camp and they call off when they meet other people, that's the actual names of the women that were in that particular training class.
I mean, it's just such an amazing story, and I rack my brain and think, why isn't it in history books? Why don't we know about this? I mean, there's probably so many other things, of course, but this is like a major part of history.
Yes.
So how long did it take you to research?
It was surprising. There's actually been a lot written about them. Charity Adams published her memoirs before she passed.
Mm-hmm.
Brenda L. Moore, she did a book about them called To Serve My Country, To Serve My Race. So it was actually easy to find the story. It was harder to get some of maybe the more day-to-day details and things like that. So I first stumbled upon this, it had to been like 2013. The reason why it took so long was more me and life versus, getting the information. Once I got the book deal with William Morrow, that's when I was like, oh, I can go research this now, because now, it would make sense to do that. So I was able to go to Fort Des Moines in Iowa, where they actually trained, the museum there, and go see where they walked and their uniforms and the story of the Women's Army Corps. And then I also went up to where Camp Schenck was, and that's where they were stationed before they shipped out in New York. So I was able to go into those archives as well. And like the actual base newspapers they had from 80 years ago, I was actually looking through those to get details, like the pie shop had just opened when they were there and what entertainers were coming through and bus schedules and things like that. So
That is
good.
interesting. So since this is your debut, but you've written stories before, how did you go from writing these short stories, if you wrote a couple of books before, but to writing this fiction novel? Like, what was your process and structure for writing this?
I kind of was on the job training, because my other ones are like novellas. So the longest one was 28,000 words.
Mm-hmm.
So Sisters in Arms is 104,000 words. So it was just it was going from writing short to being able to play with emotions and explore the scene, if you will, and talk about what they were feeling and what they were saying versus just wham, bam, thank you, man, I was here doing this and going through the plot.
Right.
So,
So just get
yeah.
more of the story, the setting.
Yes.
So let's talk about them. Can you tell us? I know this is like a huge, you've probably been asked this and how to, dwindle it down to an elevator speech, but tell us a little bit about the 6888, like,
Mm-hmm.
just anything.
Okay. The 6888, as I said, was the only all-black, all-female unit to go overseas during the war. And their mission was to get the mail moving again. There was a huge backlog going back in 1944 with D-Day and that initial push into the continent, and when they started defeating the Germans, and everybody thought the war would be over by Christmas of 44. So that the mail wasn't the priority. It was moving troops, getting weapons and things like that. Once the war wasn't over by Christmas, now you have about 6 months worth of mail building up, all the Christmas packages, things like that. And morale was starting to go down because you had some rough battles like Battle of the Bulge and things like that. So troop morale, U.S. troop morale was down. They hadn't heard from home, hadn't heard, that kind word or something that would give you the oomph to go on. If you've been to summer camp or if you've been in the military, you know what that letter does. So they first sent some guys over to try and sort through this backlog, and they couldn't do it. And just for context, it was 6 airplane hangars full of mail, floor to ceiling, front to back. If you've ever seen one of those semi sphere ones, or even an airplane hangar in general, that's a lot of mail. I think it was like a couple million, more than a couple million pieces of individual packages. So the first unit of guys they sent in couldn't figure it out. Then they sent some women in, they couldn't figure it out. So they gave this now impossible task to the black women, because back then it was basically,
it's
let's go out of our way to not let you shine.
Right.
Yeah. So because of security and things like that, they were sent over there not knowing what their mission was. So they didn't have specific training on this is how you set up a mail distribution system from scratch or anything like that. So they went over, saw this big mess, if you will. So you figure they got there in February of 45. So by then you had like 3 or 4 months since grandma sent those cookies, that came from home. So the rats had already gotten into it, it was wet and spoilage, things leaking. And then not everybody knew how to address the package correctly. So where today we know, okay, first name, last name, even if you know what their unit is, things like that. Sometimes it would just be like Bobby in the Army.
Oh, so locating folks, right? Oh my goodness.
Yeah, so basically, and there's no computers, there's no internet. So it was basically an index card system that they came up with for, the few million American soldiers, military officers, the U.S. Red Cross volunteers. Everybody had their own index card. So every time they moved, somebody had to update the index card. Every time, someone passed away, had to update the index card and where to send things like that. So they had to go and sort through all this mail. They had special teams. One lady in the videos, you'll see, I did the ends. I was the end girl. So everybody whose last name started with N came through her. They had special teams. In the book, I call it the Bob job. So if there's 15,000 Robert Smiths in the U.S. Army in Europe, and you just put Rob, Bob, Bobby, whatever, that was their team's job to figure out who that 1 out of 15,000 Bobbies would go to.
If someone just on the looking at this would think, okay, it's just mail, but when you talk about the amount of mail, and then actually what mail really means, I grew up Army brat, so I know what my mom, when she wrote letters to my dad when I was little, but what it means to the soldiers, and that amount of mail, no small feat at all. So I find people thinking like, oh, they're just went over there to do the mail, but no, they like really help boost the morale.
A lot of us wouldn't exist without that mail. In the documentary, the 6888, one of the congressmen from Kansas who sponsored the monument at Fort Leavenworth, he was sitting there talking. While he was talking, he realized, and he was actually emotionally moved. you know what? My parents got married after the war. They met before the war, and it was their letters that kept that relationship going. He's like, wait a minute, I exist because you ladies sort of got those letters from my mom to my dad. And it was just like, it's a big deal.
Yeah, it's a very, very big deal. So I want to talk about how they came to go into the characters, but how did is it the whack, right?
Yeah, the whack.
How it became to be, because I think in your book, and I love your book, actually puts like real prominent people in history in the book, and one of them is Mary McLeod Bethune. And I have a connection because she is a soror.
Okay.
And my son went to Bethune, graduated from Bethune-Cookman College.
Yep, and she's buried right.
When I was reading the book, I was like, oh my gosh. So it's so interesting. Tell that story. It's not giving anything away, you guys. So, but I just thought that connection was very, she was a major part of this battalion, how it came to be.
Mary McLeod Bethune is basically like the godmother of all the Black Wacks, not just the one unit, but all of them basically from that first training class. When they created the Women's Army Corps, and basically they knew from their experiences with World War I that women had volunteered before, but they had never been part of the officially part of the Army. So they hadn't been recipients of benefits. Like if you had been injured or killed, you didn't get Veterans Administration, VA benefits, things like that. You're just, oh, sorry, you chose to be here. You're just dead over there, and your family will find out eventually.
Right.
So Mary McLeod Bethune, going back a little bit in the 30s during the Great Depression, she was the head of the Negro Division for the National Youth Administration, part of the New Deal. So it was her job to make sure that young people, had something to do during the Great Depression, had ways to make money, and were able to benefit from the New Deal and the Works Progress Administration, things like that. So she knew as they were gearing up for the war that there would be opportunities, and that when she heard that women were now going to be a part of the Army and have be eligible for benefits, she kind of foresaw there would be educational benefits, there would be on-the-job training, housing benefits, all the things that we know about. We didn't necessarily have access to that back then. So she made sure that Black women would have opportunities within the Women's Army Corps, and that they would have opportunities to be officers. Basically, to be an officer back then, you had to have at least some college education. So she basically, in that first class of officers for the WAC, there were 40 seats set aside for Black women. If she didn't handpick those 40 herself, someone that she knew or was in another prominent role dealing with young people at that time would recommend these women to her. So she was basically, she was like buddy with Eleanor Roosevelt. And if you know anything about her, Eleanor's relationship with her mother-in-law, Sarah Delano Roosevelt, she was a piece of work, and she was actually really, Mary McLeod Bethune was good friends with her too. So she was a force. Because of her position, she was actually an advisor to 4 different U.S. presidents, including FDR.
Yes.
So she was your go-to person in terms of Black America if you needed something done.
Yeah, I love that part of when you that's in there. I definitely. So we know that, I mean, if you've read the book, it's based on fictional characters, though.
Yes.
Okay, Grace and Eliza.
Yes.
The opening, oh my gosh. Okay, I'm not going to give anything away, but I know they're fictional, but what in your research did you discover to help you draw, to help you create the characters? Because I mean, they're not based on anybody particular, or?
The personality of Grace was inspired by my Aunt Carmen. And so in my head, it's not Aunt Carmen's story, but it was her origin story, if you will, for who she became when I knew her later in life. She was the woman where at her funeral, it was an Episcopalian church, and they played I Did It My Way by Frank Sinatra on the organ.
Oh.
And she was that type of yeah, it was like she took that real stage ceremony and put her personality into it like that. So it's just like, how did you become like that? From an assignment when I was younger, I had to ask her questions about what she did during the war. And basically she had been a civilian clerk for the Army. And the only reason why she got that job, she said, was because her supervisor was amused by the fact that she was a colored girl with a college degree.
Oh.
And so basically in this book, I wrote about a bunch of colored girls with college degrees doing things during the war. So that's where I got that from, and why aspects of her personality. But I had to tell my sister, no, I'm not writing about Aunt Carmen having sex in the book. It's
Right.
okay. It's not weird. So, and also her aunt, my Aunt Florence, was a music teacher. She was actually one of the founders of a sorority, not the big four, it was a smaller one. But she was a music teacher, and she actually wrote the music curriculum for Jersey City schools in New Jersey. So that's where I kind of played with the music aspect of
Yeah,
Grace as well. Plus,
that's another important part of it. That's one of my notes was the music.
yes,
Yeah.
I'm a popular music history geek too. So I was like, oh, we're putting everything in this book.
Yeah. So
Um,
with the music, I mean, go ahead and finish about Grace and all.
so, no, I was gonna say, in terms of Eliza's story, it was based on the fact, like, when I graduated from college, I looked about 12 years old, and so it took a while for people to take me seriously, just based on how I looked and being an adult. And so I kind of put that was her version of her story, where because she was short and she looked young, and now she's an officer in the army. What was that like? Plus, she was rich. And now she's in this segregated army where people are telling her what to do, where before she was doing whatever she wanted.
Exactly. She came from a very family. And
Yes.
when I'm reading your book, I'm thinking, like, because you put us back in a time period that we're, a lot of us are not familiar with. And
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering what you were thinking, or what were you trying to have come off the pages about Black women friendships? Because even back in that time, fast forward to now, and how important, you know, sisterhood is. And
You got to have your squad.
yeah, you got to have your squad. You have to have your,
Mm-hmm.
yes.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean,
And so,
like you,
and also talk about how we all have each other's back. Sometimes the one who has your back isn't necessarily your best friend. She might be the one, I can't stand her. She gets on my nerves. But in certain situations, she gonna have your back because she knows what's up.
yes, that's exactly. I mean, so, was that, I'm sure that was intentional to display those characters in that way. Can you talk a little bit about?
Yeah. Um, for those who haven't read the book, and not necessarily spoiling anything because it happens pretty quick, is you have these very two distinct personalities. They're both Northern girls, and when they first meet each other, they clash. And it's just something about their personalities. They both clash and clash and clash. And they're two different types of Black women. There's somebody who comes from a prominent, well-to-do family, and someone who comes from one that's struggling. A lot of times when we hear about our stories from back then, it's always the downtrodden, you're a sharecropper, you everything that could ever bad that can happen to you in life happens, and you don't see people necessarily in other situations. And there's so many other stories like that. So I wanted to play with that. And then it's like, okay, what do you do if you take this spoiled rich girl and stick her in the army? Kind of like Private Benjamin, but she's a Black girl in the 40s. She's going to have some problems. She might not be in shape. And they're not cutting you any slack because you're a woman anyway. They're definitely not cutting you slack because you're Black.
For sure.
And now you got to deal with it. What do you do?
Yes. So let's go back to the music, because the music in itself is a character. We start off with Grace is auditioning for the yard.
Yes.
I mean, that's huge, right? And
Mm-hmm.
jazz music.
Yes.
So can you please talk about that? I love the music aspect.
I actually read half the history of Juilliard just to write that particular part of the book, because I wanted to make sure I got it right. There was actually, in the school that became Juilliard, they had Black female students as early as the 20s. If you're familiar with Hazel Scott, she was offered enrollment when she was 8 years old, so that had to have been in the 20s or the 30s. So I wanted to have just, when I first had the character, she was just kind of whatever, I'm going to join the army. And it was just like, but what was your dream before there was a war? You had something. And she's like, I want to be a concert pianist. And I was like, oh, I don't know anything about classical music. All right, let's do that. So I had it where, she's in Harlem, and just like, okay, where does that music happen? And, I had, oh, you live down the street from Minton's Playhouse. Okay. And reading about the history of Minton's Playhouse and things that were going on. Then we don't have a musical record of the jazz music at that time because of the war. Everything you needed to make the record had to be requisitioned. And so bop if you're familiar with jazz, is bebop
Mhm.
was the music that evolved out of that time period. So I kind of talk about that. And you had all girl orchestras because all the men were in the military. So you have all these musicians, you have the Lil Hardin Armstrongs, you have Billie Holiday coming up. So it was just that touch of, this was a big piece of Black culture at that time. So I wanted to put that in there. There are the musicians, a lot of the musicians that I put in there, they're real. Well, all of them are real people.
Yeah.
Almost all of them are real people. There is one Easter egg person in there that's not named, and if you're a really big jazz geek, you might figure out who that person is. I won't give it away. So it was important because that was, listening to the radio was was the TV, was the internet. So that's how music was just a very big part of that time period, and I love it. So
I want to ask this, but I know it's not giving anything away because it's like the first couple of pages. But the way you Juilliard, and she received some devastating news. Is do you say that was her catalyst for her going in the direction that she went into?
it she was kind of just going along with the flow of the program of her life that her mother set out for her. And she kind of was just like, this is what I'm good at. This is what I'm going to do. But she's wrestling with it. It's not, you know what? I need to break out of this mold of my mother directing my life and molding my life. I'm 26 years old. I still live at home. When do I get to have a life? And so, um, with her brother's encouraging words ringing in her ears, she had this impulsive nature that she couldn't necessarily play on all the time because of that rigid nature to be at that level musician thing. Like you practice every day, you do everything a certain way. And it was just everything kind of exploded in that moment in that first chapter. And she was just like, screw it. I'm just going to do whatever.
Right.
The first thing that crosses my path.
Yeah, it's real. It's really, really good. I mean, I love information, and I mean, the research is great. You provided so much information, and so I want to know. I mean, do you TV series, movie?
Sure.
Was
I accept.
I accept?
There's nothing that I know about. I know that there's been inquiries, so we'll see what happens. I hope so.
Phenomenal movie.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
It could be a series too.
yes, and I think it's
I think it.
a forgotten or unknown part of history that everyone should know about.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my goodness. Okay, we got.
I think everything in the book because people are like, "Oh, what do you wish you could put in the book?" There's so many other stories. This is just one aspect of the Black female experience in the military during the war. I didn't talk about the women that were still here and what they had to go through. At one point, there were two whack bands because of segregation, and the black band was better than the white band, and they should disband the black band and things like that. So in Massachusetts, they went on strike. These soldiers actually went on strike and faced mutiny charges because of their unfair working conditions. So there's just so much the LGBTQ experience. I didn't even find concrete hints at it until like the last month before I turned it in, so I couldn't even explore that, you know, in the book. So there's so much in there.
Okay, and one thing I wanted to ask you when you talked about that they went over to fail, right? But they're actually in a war zone. So did they get any training? What was that like for them?
Before they went to New York to ship out, they were at Fort Oglethorpe in Georgia, and they received basic overseas training about, how to be on the boat, how to conduct yourself if they're shelling you. But because they were women, doesn't matter that they were black women, because they were women in the 40s, it wasn't ladylike to know how to shoot a gun, to carry weapons, things like that. And they weren't supposed to be in an active war zone. They're supposed to be in safe places. But even the white women were getting, if you were in London, you were getting bombed every night. When the 6888 got to England, it was towards the end of the war. I know that they had at least one air raid warning. They might have experienced some bombing, but it wasn't in city central where they were, if they did. But when they got there, they would have seen bombed out buildings and things like that and fresh graves. So you didn't know they didn't know that it was the end of the war, or that, any given moment they could have had bombs dropping on them. When they were on the boat going over, the first group that went over, their boat was chased by a U-boat, by a submarine, a German submarine. So it had they could have been blown out of the water, they could have been boarded, anything could have happened. So there was interesting when we picked the name Sisters in Arms for the book. At first I was like, no, but they didn't carry weapons. And then I was like, wait a minute, their weapons weren't the ones that you shoot. It was, they figured it out. They figured out how to protect themselves while they were overseas, despite not having weapons that you could shoot. Whenever racism happened or sexism happened, they figured out other weapons to use. So it was intense.
I read somewhere or listened to an interview where you said that they went to a class themselves. That's
Yes, when they were in England, they organized their own jujitsu classes.
oh, okay.
So they were able, so they could use their hands,
Right.
and maybe you might see some of that in the book. I don't know.
So, what did you want readers to take away from this novel? Because there are so many takeaways.
I would say my initial, or at the core of it, the book that I wrote for me, this is the book I wish I had when I first entered the workforce. When we all have certain situations, you're like, is it me? Did that just happen? I want people who may be in that situation where someone is maybe denying you opportunities because of how you look, or they perceive you to be, or how they perceive what skills you may have or are capable of. How to deal with that. You're not alone. It's happened before. It happened 80 years ago.
Yeah.
Some techniques and tools you can use to advocate for yourself, to help you navigate your career. And also, sometimes I had this big plan for my life. I was supposed to be married and done with kids by 25, and I was going to be some kind of vice president somewhere by the time I was 30, and that didn't happen. And it was like, it took me a while to figure out, once all that didn't happen, what do I do with myself? Right? It took me 20 years to realize, oh, okay, I'll write a book. So that, and also for younger women dealing with, sometimes you meet the perfect guy on the worst day of your life, and had you met him yesterday, had you met him 2 weeks later, everything would be fine. But because you met him today, what do you do with that?
Right. Yeah. What do you? That's true. That's
Yeah.
That's a big part of the book too. What do you do with that?
Yeah. What do you do with that?
Hold on, let me see. I have a question.
Do
Oh, this is one of. If you guys please have questions, please drop them in the box. This is one of my. What can you expect next? Can you share what you're working on?
Yes, I am working on my next book. It's called In a League of Her Own, and it's my Negro Leagues book. And it's not about the Black female players in the Negro Leagues, but actually a Black female owner. Well, she was a woman of color, we're pretty sure. She's actually currently the only woman enshrined in the Baseball Hall of Fame. I just came back from Cooperstown a few weeks ago to research her.
Oh, wow. That's going to be interesting, especially.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's going to be really.
Yeah. And we're going to see the other side of Jackie Robinson's historic moment.
Oh my God. That research, I'm sure, is going to be mind blowing.
Mm-hmm. And actually, everybody focuses, her name is Effa Manley. Everyone focuses on her baseball life. But before she was in baseball, she actually spearheaded the effort to desegregate the workforce on 125th Street in the 30s. Back then, you could shop on 125th Street all you wanted, but if you were Black and you wanted a job, they wouldn't hire you.
Really?
Yeah, so she spearheaded the campaign and the boycott so that Black people could work on 125th Street as salespeople and not just janitors and maids.
And so when can we expect this novel that's going to knock people's socks off, I feel?
I think it's right now, it's slated for spring of 23.
Okay. All right. Perfect. Mm-hmm. And what are you currently reading yourself? Any recommendations?
Ooh, I just finished an advanced copy of By Design by Piper Hughley. And that is about the fashion designer Anne Colso. She designed and created Jackie Kennedy's wedding dress when she married JFK. And it's her story. And it's not just about the dress. And it's amazing.
Oh, awesome.
That comes out June.
Okay, that's in June. You guys put that on?
Yes.
What's it called again?
Mhm. By Design.
By Design. Okay. Oh, by Piper.
Mhm.
Yes. Put that.
Yes. Mhm.
So, what would be what's the thing that surprised you the most, like in research, and then
Mhm.
the book is out in the world? Like, what has surprised you the most? So during while you were.
In,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of research, that would be I'm not necessarily giving anything away. If you look up 688, the story comes out where when they were in Europe, their commanding officer, Major Charity Adams, actually basically told, she didn't go off on the general, but she kind of told him off and got away with it.
Oh,
He gave her an order that wasn't correct and she disagreed with it and she told him over my dead body, sir, and she remained in charge.
wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So read that part of the book, that actually did happen.
Okay. And then so now out in the world, what has been the most surprising thing um, for you?
The fact, well, when I was writing the book, part of the reason why it took me so long is when I would hit a roadblock for whatever reason, I'm like, I'll just put it down. Nobody wants to read this book anyway. So the fact now that it's out in the world and so many people have read it, and it's been Book of the Month Club, it's been Wall Street Journal Book of the Month, Steph Curry's book club. He just gave a shout out on Twitter and destroyed my mentions. Thank you, not complaining. So just that reception, and just even female soldiers and veterans, and they're not necessarily even black, white, whatever. It isn't just black women who are telling me, they're like, yes, this feels right. Thank you for writing this book. And I'm just like, okay, good, because I'm not military at all. So I was like, okay, I hope I get that part right.
Yeah, I'm an Army brat. My dad served for 30 years. So I totally like. I was all
Mm-hmm.
when I saw it, and they were like, "I'm like, yes, I'll do the cover reveal." But then I don't know the story.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I can't do enough for writing it and putting it out in the world because it's something people need to know about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. They did some things, and I've always wondered, because you would see like at least for my age group, our grandmothers and my aunties and things like that, they were a force. They knew how to get something done with nothing. I'm just like, how did they get like that? And this is one of the reasons how they got like that. It's just like, oh, okay, wow. And the things that they don't talk about necessarily because they don't see it as a big deal, is like, oh, that's just what I did during the war. And you're like, wait a minute, you like made history and things like that, and you're amazing. I found out after I turned in the book, my grandfather's sister was one of the officers in the WAC. She wasn't in that first class, but she was an officer. And I was just like, and then her reading her biography, I was just like, oh my God, I wish I had known. I wish I'd had a chance to meet her.
Yes. That I mean, it's and it opens up conversations.
Yes.
Thing that I like about it. It opens up conversations, and so that's great. And it should be taught in school or discussed in schools and in history for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So I can't think of
But
again when the Instagram is still going on and we're doing something different or whatever to talk about
mm-hmm.
your upcoming work.
I will definitely do that.
Thank you so much for being here. It was such a pleasure.
Okay, thank you for having me. This has been awesome.
Bye bye.
Bye.